So, so what do you got for us, Brad?
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works.
Want to let everybody know we'll be recording today.
Okay, so I hope everybody can see that. I can, which is nice. So
Yeah.
today I was going to talk about the stories we tell ourselves. And before I start, let me tell a story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a man who lost his wife when he turned 60. He became a widower. He was very much in love with her. He had 38 years of marriage with her. And in 38 years, he really was very much directed through that relationship. Most of the communication came through his wife with his children. He was a loving father, always present, but he wasn't, if you will, his own self, because he didn't really know who he was. Why didn't he know? Well, his father had been institutionalized when he was 6. So he really did not grow up with a father. And but he grew up in a household with strong women. So he was very much used to having strong women direct him and tell him about what to do. And suddenly at 60, he becomes a widower. And this same man happens to have 2 children. And those 2 children become a really painful source of reminder to him about the loss of his wife. And it's so painful to him that he really can't manage those relationships going forward. So instead, this man remarries, and that's kind of the end of his relationship with his children. It isn't that he doesn't love them, it's that he really can't look at his children and be able to function without remembering his first true love, his first wife. That's the story I'm going to tell right now for the moment. So let's talk about the stories we tell ourselves as we go through life, and we all have them. And so our lives are all made up of stories. I know there are a lot of words here on the slide. They're really to help me. You don't have to feel as if you have to read them, but when we're born, how we meet our spouses, there are all sorts of stories we make up about our lives and how we tell who we are. The day our children are born, you could talk about a beloved pet, that job promotion, all those kinds of things. And we have themes, we have plots, we have characters, and these stories shape our outlook about who we are. And so these are very much stories that are going on in our heads. And so much of these stories are really a reflection of our childhood experiences. They really are. Our family dynamics, our education, regional, religious differences, neighborhoods, cultures, even our political persuasion shapes the stories that are going on in our lives. So these stories also shape our voices as writers. They define really who we are, what we believe. And when we write, usually our beliefs and our core values are all based on the stories that we have growing up, about our stories of what we believe in, our religion, and they capture our interest, and that's what makes us unique as writers and how really we handle life's challenges. Because every time something comes up in our lives, usually we create a story in how we either manage through it, cope through it, how we get through that process. So if you are what you eat, then you probably write what you believe. Now that's my quote. Nobody wrote that. I wrote that. I thought that was pretty good, but I think it's true. You know, I think that we do write what we absolutely believe. And then there are other stories going on in our lives, aside from these external stories. We also have things happening in our heads. Now, I think about this a lot. When you think about if you've ever been to couples counseling and the therapist might say to you something, well, tell us about an experience that's going on with your partner. You might say, well, I told my partner I don't like scrambled eggs for dinner. And your partner might say, well, I heard that you don't think I'm a good cook. So there are all sorts of things going on in communication. What we say might actually be interpreted differently from somebody else's point of view. And so there's a whole thing that's going on in our heads. We have lots of stories in our heads. I do, and I know that I have a lot of conversations going on with myself. They're usually problems that I'm tending to recycle. It might be everything from a family, a legacy, if you will, of how to think about the world. So when I say that, for instance, if somebody doesn't like me, my family legacy might be to say, oh, well, they're just jealous, because that's what I've heard growing up. So those become the construct of what's going on internally in your head. And there are other things that I've noticed in my life that the negative tends to outweigh the positive. I seem to be a positive person. I like to laugh. I'm very upbeat. But I've noticed, for instance, with my books, that if I get a negative review on a book, that is with me all day. Forget the fact that I have positive reviews. Forget the fact that people like me and have, asked me to speak like today. I'm still tend to wallow in that negative review, if you will. So there are these not good enough stories that are going on in my head, and you might share that. I hope you don't, but you might. And we also have collect evidence to prove those stories. So I find in my life that when I have a negative thought going on in my head, I tend to go out and collect stories that reinforce that, which is really not a great thing to do. So I have to really be careful about not doing that. And what I mean is, for instance, if you get a negative review about the book, you can go on and create this whole sequence in your head about how people feel about your book. Even people who have given you a positive review, you might think, well, they just feel sorry for me. Or, oh, well, you can create all sorts of stories, trust me. So it's very much these stories that are going on in our head, and we're always convinced about our point of view. As writers, we use point of view, but as authors, we also have a point of view, and it's a very much an internal point of view, again, affected by these kinds of stories. So, okay, here's a disclaimer. I'm not a therapist, but I've had a lot of therapy. And I've had a lot of couples counseling. I've had a lot of individual therapy in my life. So I don't propose to be a therapist, but I understand that life has a way of shaping us. We bring a lot of unique experiences. We have a lot of mentors and people in our lives. And I think if you live long enough, you're bound to learn something. And, some folks call it the school of hard knocks, and that there's no really easy way. I remember thinking when I was younger, and I had a very loving family, that the first thing that happened to me that was negative, I thought, well, that's not supposed to happen. This is supposed to be a wonderful life. I mean, that's really what I thought. I was really surprised at the first adult that didn't like me, because all the adults in my life growing up liked me. And so there's that kind of no easy way to sort of learn about the world. But ultimately, we are responsible for our own decisions and what we think and how we choose to view the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So the point today is that we create the stories for our life. It's how we introduce ourselves to new people. When you make a new friend and you talk about yourself, if you pay attention to how you're presenting your story, you'll get a great idea about your theme. And we also, how we define our beliefs. When we talk about our politics or our religious beliefs, we're kind of creating our life cycle. How we explain our missteps, how we excuse our challenges, how we ignore our truth, how we cope with our tragedies, and how we set our life's path. These are all the stories that we're creating in our lives. And it's really powerful if you're a writer to think about each of these steps, because they are really the potential for our creativity. So as writers, I always think, is there really a life path? Is this free will, or is everything predetermined, if you will? I spent the first 32 years of my career as a healthcare administrator. but I always wanted to be a writer. It was always my greatest desire. As a kid, I wanted to be a writer. It was always something that was nagging at me. But can we ever know if we really have a life path? Sometimes it feels like we're searching out there and we're stumbling around for clarity. And I still feel that way. I mean, I've written 4 books and I still often am wondering, what am I doing? Is this the correct path for me? And when you look back on your life, I guess I wonder, is the road clear? And if the road isn't clear, is that how you write? Are those the stories you like to tell? Is it a jumble of happenstance, or are we kind of ricocheting in life from point A to B? And I think when you're in your life, it's hard to sort of see what's happening in the course of your experience. But sometimes if you can step back and look at the course of your life, you really get a keen insight to what's been going on. For me, I did a podcast yesterday, and through the podcast, the host asked me about my story. And I started to tell my story of my life and what took me up to the point of being a writer. And I immediately thought it sounded like a very sad story I was telling, but there's nothing sad about the story. It's a great story. And so it's interesting how it gives you a different perspective. I saw things a little bit clearer. So it's kind of interesting if you do that. I also noticed, and this is just a side point, that families tend to have the same stories. So in my family, for instance, my mother and her brother had a falling out, and that relationship didn't last. I see in my life, my brother and I have had a falling out. I see my niece and her brother have had a falling out. There's a tendency in families to repeat the same stories over and over and over. And I think it's always interesting to see if you can break that cycle or not. So let's talk about your skill set as working as an author. Are you a pantser or are you a plotter? How you write, does that reflect your worldview? So I personally am a pantser. I really would like to be a plotter, but I don't think that that works for me, because even though I always know the beginning of a book and I know the ending of the book, I never know the journey that I'm going to go on. And that's kind of reflective of how my life has kind of gone. I've decided to give up control and just go with it and stop trying to organize things, because they don't really quite work that way. And I think for a lot of authors, whether you're a pantser or whether you're a plotter, really determines how your life has been, has the trajectory of your life, if you will. Has your life been organized? Has it been sequential? Or has it sort of ricocheted? And if you're clear about getting from point A to point B, is that based on faith or talent? I always wonder. And how much of your world is part of what you write? So I believe in the seed of truth. In my writing, there's always a seed of truth. It isn't the exact story of my life. It isn't the exact story of my experiences, but there's a seed of a truth that I've experienced that comes out in my novels. And when I look at famous writers who I admire and love, I think there is a seed of truth. You know, when you look at Eugene O'Neill play Long Journey into Night, you know that there was a seed of truth. His mother was a morphine addict. And when you look at Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams, a seed of truth. His sister was, I don't want to say she was a cripple, but she had a disability. And so there's always that seed of truth that people start writing about that I think affects those stories. So that always brings me to think, what kind of family does Stephen King come from? You know, what's that seed of truth to
He
allow
writes
you
about
to,
that.
to have that kind of story? What kind of stories are going in his head? So it's always interesting to me as I read, and I'm a pretty big reader, to think about the author and what inspired the story that they're writing. I'm fascinated by that. So we all have roadblocks as we go through life, especially in our writing careers, and challenges that we have. So I'll just share with you, for me, I don't have writer's block but sometimes I do struggle to finish a story. I need to sort of cogitate a little bit more on my endings of how my books wrap up. But it's been a challenge for me to be an indie author versus a traditionally published author. And I think that has to do with the fact of self-esteem, if you will. I always believe that, and I have this belief, that if your stuff is really great, you're going to be able to be traditionally published. Somebody will find you. You'll be able to find an agent. But I think for me, I made a different decision because I really, let's face it, I'm not a young man. I don't have years and years to go. I really didn't want to wait to build a career. And so I didn't go that route. But I've noticed that even among authors who aren't self-published, but are traditionally published, there's a little bit of a feeling that maybe independent authors, indie authors are not as good. So there's kind of that kind of perspective that sort of weighs on my shoulder. It's kind of a story that's going on in my head. And I sometimes also think that I don't really have mentors. I do have editors that I've worked with that are wonderful that I've hired, and they've been really helpful, but I don't quite feel as if I have a mentor, and I feel like that's kind of missing. And when you don't have a mentor, sometimes what you think to yourself is, well, maybe I'm not good enough to have a mentor. But we also have to realize, which I think to myself, you get to a certain age where you need to be the mentor, where you need to be helping others. It really isn't about others helping you. So that's been a way of shifting a perspective as well. So what are the stories that we tell? I've told you a little bit of my stories. I have a little bit of the imposter syndrome. I have a little bit of a second career story, because this is a second career for me. I told you, I think only real authors are traditionally published. I have a little bit of that story going on. A little bit of no one likes me, so no one will like my work. That comes from childhood, when my mother would say to me, you know, Brad, if you smiled more often, people would like you. And so I'm not a natural smiler. I don't smile naturally. It's not something that my face does. I wish it did. My mother didn't smile naturally. So my brother has a great smile, so did my dad, but it's something I don't have. And I think that can put people off. So, you know, that's a story in my head. Again, indie authors are less than, that's the other issue I have. And an MFA is a crucial component to success. Now, I've read about this, and actually this is not true, that having an MFA is not a crucial component to success as a writer. And in fact, I've been on a lot of webinars and Zoom calls with writers who have actually come up without an MFA and actually do quite well financially. So that's kind of interesting. I share that, again, wishing that I still had a traditional publisher in New York who was pushing all my work, all of that. But so I think the real thing is, if we haven't found our audience, then is our work good? And that's the other message that's sort of struggling in my head. If I haven't found my audience, is my work really good? And so these are all the kinds of stories that I tell myself that are really, now that I've shared it, are kind of, aren't they unproductive? They're really unproductive, and they're generally unhelpful. But I wanted to just show you the kinds of things that I think about as I work through this challenge. So with being an indie author, there are other things I have to consider, I mean, that a traditional author doesn't. And I thought a lot about this. It requires you to really have a very different skill set as marketing and having a lot of other projects that you do. And I spend a lot of time on this, finding an audience, building an email list, creating relationships, and understanding all these other web-based products like MailChimp and BookFunnel, and building tools. And I do a lot of blogs and newsletters. I think you guys all see them. I just wrote one yesterday about how COVID would be a great name for a dog. And so these are kinds of things that I try to do to keep myself, you know, engaged and going beyond the mindset of what's happening. But to be or not to be, when you think about it, when you're an author, you really don't have a choice about it. I don't think we do. I know for me, I sit in a room for hours on end by myself. Who would do that unless you really love it and feel compelled? And as you probably know, and I do, there's so much editing to writing, so much rewriting of a paragraph over and over and over again. It's an overwhelming concept even to think about. As I think about writing my fifth book, I think to myself, do I really want to go on that journey again? And I do have a fifth book I want to write, but it's just so much work that's entailed in it. Am I doing it for my pleasure? I think it's more of a compulsion. I think it's more of a way of expressing yourself. And it's also a beautiful way of experiencing the world apart from being in the world. So, you think about Thoreau walking through the forest on Walden Pond and having that time with nature. For me, writing is about having that time with whatever ethereal energy is going on. I am not of myself. I feel as if, as a writer, I'm doing something that I am engaged with, but it's not of my making. I can't quite explain it, but it's almost like feels like a spiritual calling. So for me, it's actually not even a question of whether to be a writer or not. We're writers, and like it or not, we write, and that's what we do. So when you're a writer, who needs a therapist, right? I mean, really, who needs a therapist? You have, if you write a memoir, come on, you're working through your issues and sharing what you've learned, right? I mean, that's so any psychological damage that has happened to you through your childhood, through your adult years, you really can make it work for you in the creation of story. It's a wonderful thing to do. If family issues or social challenges, you can work that all out. It's always interesting to me how writers are always the most successful, if you will, are characterized as being a little surly, a little bit F. Scott Fitzgerald, drinking, you always hear Robert Benchley, excessive drinking, excessive partying. Well, what do you do if you're an introvert? You really can't do any. Well, I guess you could be surly, but you're probably not going to be doing that. But when you're a writer, you're more discerning. And that's what I think is the real gift that we all share, is the ability to sit back and see things in a different perspective. As writers, we discern when situations occur around us, we can see all sides of the conversation. I think we're gifted in that way. So in a way, our flaws become strengths, and our strengths are really the insights that we bring to what we do with our craft. But as writers, no one wants to be judged, and no one wants to be challenged when writing. It's unlike actors. They want to be looked at. They're happy. Look at me, look at me. But we like to hide between the lines. And I know personally, I like to get under my desk. So, when you're an introvert, it's not easy to do this kind of work. But when you write, and especially for me, I'm writing novels that I feel pretty personally tied to. It's really a look at who I am, and it's really I think it's very exposing, if you will. People who are reading the book who don't know me don't know it's exposing, but I do. So, for instance, like my last book that I've just written, my Boca by Moonlight, feels very exposing to me. It feels like I'm telling a personal story, even though I'm actually not. The book has nothing to do with my experiences, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So no matter how charming we may seem, as I said, I'm much more comfortable under the desk. It's really a gift that I've learned as a healthcare administrator for 32 years about how to be an extrovert, not necessarily how to actually be one. So as a writer, I think, for me at least, being an introvert is so much part of who I am. But unfortunately, I'm a competitive introvert. And what that means is that I really, really want people to read my work. I'm not competitive with other writers. I'm grateful for the camaraderie, but I'm competitive in the sense of the industry. I want to be read, and I think that a lot of authors, everybody wants to be read, And I think that becomes really a challenge when 4,500 books a day are put out for Kindle. Each day, 4,500 books come out. That's really a challenge to get seen in that audience. And I also think that when I look at all the social media, I feel like I'm a little too old for some of it. I really do. I struggle with it. Twitter, come on. Facebook, I'm not really a big fan. And LinkedIn, well, that really is nothing to do with, I think, books. But a lot of things that I've learned through social media is that it's about building relationships. Okay, now let me just stop and say, I know you're probably thinking, now come on, Brad, building relationships. And I would also say that seems ridiculous. But what I discovered recently is I write a lot of humor. I do humor blogs and I write with humor. I try to get humor into my novels. And so I actually came upon a Facebook website called Jewish Humor. All they do is post jokes to a Jewish community targeted to Jewish humor about really Jewish jokes. It's very ethnically driven. Well, I'm not really, I am Jewish. The book is about Jewish characters, but I'm not really very religious at all. I worked in Catholic healthcare for 25 years. If anything, I'm more Catholic than I feel than Jewish. But in the novel, it really ties to Boca Raton. It's a very Jewish community. So I've gone on this Facebook group, and for 3 months, I've been running a paid spots every day. I post something that's humorous about the book, a quote about my life, and I have been shocked. I have built a relationship with all these strangers that I don't know who are buying my book. It's the first time in my experience that I've actually seen social media work for me. And I think part of it is that I've got the right target audience, I have the right product, and I'm the right person at the right moment in the right site. And so that's really kind of worked for me. And I've been surprised by it. So that's all I'll say about social media, except I've been looking at things like Instagram, which I think and then TikTok. There are a lot of authors doing, I think it's called Book Talk. And I can't see myself doing it. It just seems beyond me to really do it, but you never know. I'm having such a great response with Facebook. And by the way, I've been writing since 2013. So it's a long time for me to say social media hasn't worked for me. But now to see it has worked with this product, I've been really surprised. And I will say, most of my sales coming through Amazon for this book are not through Amazon advertising. It's through this website, this Facebook website. So that's really been an eye-opener for me. So we're kind of world builders as authors. We create our universe, and it's wonderful because the characters actually say what we long to hear. I get in my novels to have people say what my family never knew how to say. I get to recreate that. I get to be comforted by the words that they're saying. And it's just wonderful. You get to correct all the flaws of your life. So in romance, you can be handsome. And in sci-fi, you get to be brilliant. And in YA, it's puberty without pimples. It's wonderful. If you write young adult, you can do that. And then historical fiction, you can really have an association with people who are brave and strong and courageous. So I think it's a wonderful thing that we as writers can do to escape, if you will, and to live through our art. So what we experience in our lives is really, as I said, a story made up in our minds. I also believe that. So even though, and I know this is kind of weird, so for those of you who, please forgive me, but sometimes there's a spiritual component. If you're a Buddhist, I'm not a Buddhist, but if you are a Buddhist, you don't believe in anything as real that surrounds you. In other words, all these possessions are not about what is happening. Buddhists believe that we're a spiritual being experiencing a drama, if you will. And I buy that. I think that that's probably true. So who we are, what others think of us, how talented we are, how loving we are. Those are all things we create, I think, in our mind, and we get to choose. We get to choose. And I think that's the one thing in the trajectory of my life is, what do you want to be? What do you choose to experience? And so you can sort of fill in the blank about whatever you want to experience. I think you can create it. And I think as writers, we need to think through all the parts of what we're experiencing and how we think and what we're creating. Because I think through our stories that we're telling ourselves, both internally and externally, I think we are creating a lot of our own experience. And so stories, when you think about stories, we all know that there are lots of parts to them. They're comprised of protagonists, antagonists, all of these elements. There's a lot of ways to change your story. A lot of ways to change your story, and a lot of ways to change the story going on in your head. So you may be wondering why I'm talking about this. It's because I actually used this technique to create my next work, which is Spoken by Moonlight. I tried to work through the story of what I told you in the beginning about the widower who was 60 years old, deeply in love with his wife, 38 years married, and then after his wife dies, really ends the relationship with his children because it's too painful for him. That's one story that I see. And there are lots of elements of that story that can be played with and changed and worked through. So that brings me to the next part of the discussion. If we have stories in our lives, and if we tell stories, are we actually reliable narrators of our own lives? What I mean by that is what we emphasize, what we leave in, what we leave out, how we project our stories in a specific way. Are we really telling them in the most accurate light? Are the stories about what we're living and what we're experiencing valid? And a perfect example might be if you have a problem with your sibling, let's say. What's the story that your sibling has from their perspective, as opposed to what you see from your perspective? So are we reliable narrators? Well, I think we're unreliable narrators. I really do. I don't think we purposely mislead anyone about our stories. And I think they are true from the current point of view. I do. But to tell a story is almost to project a moral position. And stories are the ways that we kind of make sense out of our lives, why we were treated a certain way, maybe how we treated someone else. But what happens when we tell stories that are misleading, incorrect, or wrong? What happens when we do that? Well, we kind of get stuck. We do. We get stuck in the relationships. We get stuck ourselves in our stories. And we also get stuck as authors writing our novels. We get stuck because we might not be telling the story exactly the way that it could be told, which requires us to change some of the circumstances. So if you're paying attention to what I'm saying, and I know you all are, you're probably all thinking, oh my God, he's lost it. But what I'm saying here is that we have stories in our heads, we have stories that we're creating, and sometimes we get stuck personally, and we also get stuck as authors writing our stories. So when we get stuck, sometimes the circumstances that we've lived have shaped those stories. And if we change our stories, can we change our lives? Can we edit our way out of what is messing us up? The way we edit our way out of what is messing us up in our stories. So what information is extraneous? How can a protagonist move forward or, from stop going in a circle? And what's the arc of that storyline? Do plot points reveal a different theme? So let's talk about plot. Who's supporting you in the wrong version of your story? It's usually us that's doing that. What is the narrator not willing to see? So let me just step back and tell you that one of the most powerful experiences I've had in the last couple of weeks is I actually put together a resume of my writing career. As I said, I was a healthcare administrator for 32 years, and I had a resume. I always knew about where I was in my career trajectory because of that resume. I could look at that piece of paper and see exactly who I was and what my skill set was and how marketable I was. And so I put together a resume as a writer to see what that looked like. And that was a really powerful exercise for me. Suddenly I was able to see, I'm on my 4th book. I mean, if you're not a writer after 4 books, my gosh, what are you? So that helped me get in touch with that feeling of being an imposter. So anyway, what is a narrator not willing to see? What are you not willing to see about your life that's holding you back? And what are the truths beyond just the compassion? And so what I mean by that is, there are things that are true about who we are that sometimes we have trouble really seeing. We have trouble seeing that we're good friends, or that we're loving spouses, or that we're good parents, or we're great doggy parents. I mean, there are lots of truths that we have to have some compassion for ourselves about, especially, I think, as writers. We spend a lot of time maybe alone, maybe in our heads. And I think sometimes we have to look at ourselves standing back a little bit from that. So what would happen if you looked at your story and wrote it from another point of view? And just by the point of changing that point of view, are there other choices in the plot? So let me tell you now about my experience. Gosh, I wonder if I could get out of this. Okay, well, whatever. My book that I wrote is called Bokeh by Moonlight. And so I'm going to tell you the story now about that widower. He's a 60-year-old widower. He's lost his wife, and he discovers that he doesn't really have many friendships, and that his wife has really helped him in his life communicate with his children. And when his wife dies, suddenly he has all these problems communicating with his adult children. And as he looks around, he has the same problems with friends. And he goes on a journey to discover who he is, the meaning of friendship, and the importance of his children in his life. So that's just another story. And by really shifting my mindset and my point of view, I was really able to create the next book, which is Bokeh by Moonlight. So I really would encourage all of you to think about your stories in your lives, the ones that may not be working for you, and think about how you can express that as a writer and how you can really reshape your point of view. That's the presentation for today.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me just open that up a little. Did I lose everybody, or was that, let me just close
I'm
that.
here.
We're here.
We're here.
Yeah, here.
We're all here.
You're all there with me?
Yeah, just close your
Yeah,
share
enjoyed
screen.
it.
Oh,
Enjoyed
good.
listening.
Okay, good. Yeah. Did it resonate? Do you guys have this going on where you have a story in your head and then
Brad,
Yeah.
can I just ask you to close your share screen?
I wish I could. I'm not sure how to, oh, I see. Yeah.
Just press the share screen.
Okay.
If you can't do it, I can do it.
I wish you would, because here, I
Okay.
see stop share. Got it. Okay.
Okay, got
I
it?
couldn't figure that out. Okay. Yeah. So did any of that resonate, I hope?
You know, it's funny when growing up, I was always told I was oversensitive. And then, you know, I married a wonderful man who's very easygoing and non-judgmental and just, you know, exceptional that way. And he kind of relabeled me as the sensitive artistic type.
Right.
And that just kind of changed my whole attitude about myself. You know, I'm an artistic type. You know?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to go back to the 1970s in the book business and throw some light on this whole real writer versus not real writer thing that we get into. Back in the early 70s, when I got into the book business, you only had one way to be a writer, and that was to get an agent in a traditional publishing house and go through all that. That was the only way. But shortly after that, a lot of publishing houses became incorporated into big conglomerate corporations, and they were no longer books, they were arts and entertainment. They were like movies, they were to make money. And instead of cultivating new artists, new writers, of course, writers are artists, so it's kind of a combination deal there. They would go more and more and more with investing in the sure thing. And then people were flailing around, how do I become a published author? Because when I was first in the book business, if someone came walking in with a stack of his books, we literally did not let him in the door. That's how it was. These books can't possibly be good because they're self-published. But at the time, only about 35,000 consumer books were being published a year. Nowadays, there are over 1 million published. We have all these different ways to be published. And like you said, you found you don't have to have an agent. You can be self-published. You can have a small publishing house. You can do it this way. You can do it that way. So yeah, it's a whole different world.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And I think that it's a whole different world. It's challenging because as a writer, you know, if you're going to go self-published, you better be willing to market your stuff. And that means you have to learn how to market on Amazon. You have to get an editor, you have to get a publisher, a proofreader, you have to get a cover designer. You really have to be the publisher. And you have to learn all of those trades. And it's not so easy to do. It really isn't.
No, but even nowadays, if you are not the headline guy or gal,
Yeah.
Stephen King,
Right.
you still have to, even if you have a traditional publisher, they don't have the money to put in for a lot of promotion.
Right.
You're still going to be having to fill in that gap.
Yourself, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I follow two authors. I follow in their blogs. I'm a big follower of Mitch Albom, who he's a sports writer, but he wrote Tuesday with Maury. I'm from Detroit. I lived in Detroit many years. So Mitch Albom is from Detroit. So I follow him and I see what he's doing. And then I also follow Nicholas Sparks, you know, which everybody sort of knows him. And the thing that's been so interesting as I watch Mitch Albom, he's written a book recently about an adopted child that he adopted from, I think, a third world country. And I can see already that he's having trouble selling that book, a little bit of trouble.
Really?
Because he's giving away chapters now on his blog. And so it's interesting I'm not saying he won't sell. I think he will. He's a great guy and a wonderful author. And I'm sure that book will do very well. But I could see now he's beginning to do more of a self-published kind of thing to get his books read. That is not a traditional tactic that you see them giving away chapters. He'll give away chapter 1, and then 2 weeks later, he'll give away chapter 2, and then 2 weeks later, chapter 3. He's really trying to get you to buy the book. So it's been, so I'm seeing a lot of traditional publishing tactics coming down the road that self-published authors have used to try to get capture their audience. So yeah.
And sticks, stones, bribery, threats, coercion, candy, whatever.
Hi Meredith, I see you. Hi.
Years ago, many years ago, I went to a writing conference. You paid money to go to it. in Virginia Piper. And there was a session, or a broad session, general session of agents. And they all said one thing: don't come to us, we'll come to you. But then how would they come to you? They would discover you through your stories that you had published, your small stories. And then there were some writing sessions. The one I was in, the man, we had sent our pieces of writing to him, but he didn't bother reading them. Came in and said, I didn't bother with you because I knew you wouldn't know how to write.
What?
So there were so many
A waste of money.
well, yes, no fooling. But the problem was that there were all these women in the bathroom sobbing because they had spent money coming and they were so disappointed and everything. Well, that was a big turnoff for me about agents. But as I've been working on this current book, I have this issue of, I don't want to self-publish. I just don't want to do that. But here, to me, until I heard about this indie business, still I don't want to do all this stuff. But
I don't blame you.
but okay, so I hear about this Christian agent, and he's the big time Christian agent all over, but he's here in Phoenix. So I hear about him, and I go to his website. So now the positive, he's not my number one effort, okay? But he does a blog, an email every day. And I've really learned a lot from that because there's also ties to other things. If I was to go with him, the effort that you have to spend just to get into his mailbox is incredible.
Yeah.
And they get 900 submissions a year, and they take about 12 across all genres.
Right.
And then they say, we do this, we know we sound terrible, mean, cruel, but we can't sell them to the publishers. It's very discouraging to me to open one of their emails. So but that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Unless you just publish, I just published my book, Indie, and I do it for the love of publishing it.
Right.
And not for selling a whole lot. Although I have to say, Marie, my 2014 now was published with a traditional publisher, I guess you would call it, kind of at the low rung of doing that. But I did sell 800 of them, and you said that was good, huh?
That is
But
good. Yeah.
nonetheless, I'm just expressing that this conundrum of, I think I have had to go back to my truth. What am I doing it for? I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it not so I'd be a big shot out selling a whole bunch on the shelf. I'm doing it because I want to do it. I want to see the completion of it.
I think you're right, Meredith. And I think for me, I sort of am doing it because I wanted a second career. I didn't want to do healthcare anymore, but I wanted a second career. And what I've learned is I've recreated my second career as I did my first career, meaning my first career was a lot of energy and a lot of effort and a lot of change and a lot of studying. And I really recreated what I did in my first career, my second career, instead of maybe sitting back and going, well, it's okay, let it be. So that's the kind of process, that I'm becoming increasingly aware of.
And you've gone and you've, in a sense, embraced having to learn to do these marketing steps.
Very unwillingly. I seem to be willing, but I'm very unwilling. My first book, after my first book came out, I was working with connecting with a group of authors, and they all said, you have to write a blog. It's really important to write a blog now. You have to get a newsletter out and a blog. And I really resented having to write something else. I really did. I was annoyed by it. I mean, because I was already writing a second novel, but that humor blog, I have fallen in love with it. What I've discovered is that the things that what you resist persists. Did you ever hear that kind of line? You know, if you resist it, maybe just give into it and try it. You'll love it. Because everything I've tried to do, I've really resented doing it deep inside. Every time I've started, there's been a resentment. You know, I don't want to do that. That isn't what I'm here to do. I want to write.
Exactly.
I've learned so much. Like I saw you grab your face. You went, oh no, I don't want to do it.
Exactly.
I have the same feeling. And I think everyone who ever has had to work on a new laptop or have new software installed or work on a new iPhone knows that feeling of, oh no.
Are we by definition not techies? Is that, I mean,
Yeah.
Connie up in Payson, she's a techie, but all of the rest of us are just.
Yeah. Yeah. But what happens is, you know, you're working on a laptop, you're probably using Word, right? Now, you know, 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, you wouldn't have known how to do that. So we're all, unfortunately, you know, either we get into this or we are left behind. And that's kind of how I look at it. But I don't like it either. I don't like it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we should have such a thing as Hertz rent a grandchild. So they can just come in and do that for you, because it's also, it's very confusing. I'm
Well,
looking at,
that's true. That is somewhat true, somewhat true. But oh, grandma, like, it's so easy.
Brad, I think one of the things that interested me in your talk was how you can change your story. And as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the stories in my life that I wish were different. And I thought, well, I could change that. I could have a better relationship with my sister in the story, right? My daughter maybe, you know, would come out better. My adopted daughter, there'd be different relationships there. I could change that. And that, you know, I never thought of a memoir because there's too many painful stories. But I could maybe take those painful stories and change them as to how I would like them to be. So I like that. Thank you.
I liked that too. I have two sisters that are ER nurses, and I'm an ER nurse. And when they read my book, they said, wow, it reminds me of the things I really, really liked about nursing. I got a lot of stories, but when I wrote my book, I turned them into what was the spirit of it, and what we did good, and what people do for you, and the teachers in life school that are in the ER and in all of our lives. So I just thought, I like what you said about you can take your stories and heal yourself and others by giving them an experience where you put in some thought to where are we going with this, and what do we want to say, and do we want people to feel something better about themselves, or, you know, I just loved the way you were talking. And it hit me when you were saying, my father and mother had difficult relationships with their siblings. I have 8 siblings. Thank you, Jesus, you know? And I had an Irish Catholic mother. And I'm telling you what, I found out that my father had a problem with his brother, and my mother had a problem with her brother because my father got drunk at her brother's. And now with 8 brothers and sisters, God is giving me lessons and challenges. So, but I like what you said about that you can just work with that and just say, oh, that's the way other people are, because you think you're so unique. You think you're the only one that goes through that. So thank you, Brad.
Yeah, and there's art in all of this. There is art, you know, I mean, not the particular story, but there's an angle of the story that can be art. So, yeah.
Well, now, I heard something different from when you were going through that part, because I don't know, I said maybe the last time we were together, or the book group, whatever, that I had come to a real moment, I guess, and chopped off the first 2 chapters. right when I was ready to pitch my book, which has ended up being kind of traumatic. I didn't think it would be, but I've had to massage the whole rest of it. And I think that's what, in some senses, I was taking down your little steps after that. I mean, that's a moment that you have to really consider all those other points that you had under there. You know, if you think of your personal story, well, there are things that you have to do, but if you think about the story that you're writing, and I think that's an important point. Even if you don't chop off the first 2 chapters, you know, you need to step back and see the strength of your story. And could it be seen from a different point of view? And do you want to write it from both that point of view and the other point of view? Do you want it to, I mean, not wholly, but do you want it to be that strong?
Mhm.
I think, you know, or have at least know it for yourself, know what the other one would be. I think that would strengthen the story.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good
I thought
takeaway.
that was very, to me, that was a very good point that you were.
Good. That's a good takeaway for sure. Yeah. Rebecca, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking about what we do when we write, and I started a trilogy at one point, historical fiction, and I was writing about this one character, and it's this whole other time and place, you know, that I've never been to and all that, but I was just so fascinated with it, and I'm writing about this character, and I'm thinking, this character reminds me of someone. It was my mother. And then I saw bits of myself and bits of other people in these different characters, but this one character was so strongly my mother. It was fascinating. But I love how when we write a story, and you know, maybe our real lives haven't been that marvelous, and then we change them a little into a story.
Mhm.
And we're setting what we're doing. It's actually like parenting. You're demonstrating a more positive choice. Say, okay, yeah, that's going on, but here's a possibility. Think about this.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time. Is there any last minute?
I do have a question. Brad, how available are your slides?
Completely available. I'll send them to Susan. She can
Okay,
share them, right?
thank you.
Susan, is that okay?
Sure. Well, do you
Yeah.
want me to share them to all of Central or?
Sure.
Can I just take, as I said in the beginning, for those of you who are here, this is being recorded this time.
Oh,
So I'll take a look and see how it goes. I'm going to send it to Brad. But what we'll do, any that are recorded, we'll put on the members only section of APW.
okay.
So they would be available to people.
That's a good idea.
Okay, just as an aside, I haven't recorded and saved it or edited anything yet, so it'll be an experience.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and